And she said to me, if you have the ability to go to these places and write about them, then you have an obligation. And that was it. And that became my life path and my life work. And I've never regretted it for a second. And it's been hard and it's been difficult, and it is highly dramatic and challenging. And this morning I was saying to my son, who's 16, I'm speaking to these remarkable students of medicine who are part of Physicians for Human Rights. And I hope as I'm talking about the wars, I don't cry, because it's still, and I'm happy that I have that part of me left, like the ability to feel such deep compassion and empathy, which all of you in your practices to come, I'm sure will keep and retain. So from the West Bank and Gaza, I spent 3 years there, and I wrote a book about it, which was very personal, about wandering through the West Bank and Gaza and interviewing people. And that was my first real experience with trauma, with very deep trauma, how to gather evidence without re-traumatizing people. From there, I went to Bosnia, and Sebastian and I have talked about this. And Bosnia changed my life in a way and marked me and made me the person I am today. There's probably not a waking hour that goes by that some way Bosnia doesn't come back to me. What I learned, what I saw, what I witnessed, and what marked me. I arrived in Bosnia really ill-prepared for a war of that kind. And, most of you probably know that Sarajevo was besieged. So we lived, the journalists who reported it, we lived side by side with civilians. So what they were getting, we were getting. So they were getting shelled and sniped. We were getting shelled and sniped. They were living on humanitarian rations. So were we. But that was my first experience of working with doctors. So I wandered up to the Kosovo hospital, and there I met some of the bravest human beings I've ever met, who were the emergency room doctors, who were taking in, dozens of people and trying to heal them with the most limited supplies of anesthetic, of antibiotics, of antivirals, of even the most basic stuff, of dressings, of disinfectant. And they were working, they all lived in the hospital. And so, at first they were very suspicious of me and of all journalists, because they just felt like, what are you doing? But then I became very, very close to some of them, in particular one anesthesiologist who was called Vesna Cenic, who just, over the 3 years of the siege, when I would go back and forth to visit her, I just saw her courage and her resilience and her determination to keep healing, and to retain the Hippocratic Oath and to do what she did best under the most appalling conditions. So the war in Bosnia, as many of you probably know, culminated in the genocide at Srebrenica in 1995, where 8,000 Muslim men and boys were marched into a forest and slaughtered. I've never gotten over that, because I felt in some way responsible as part of the international community. And as a reporter, we knew it was coming, and we tried desperately to call attention to it, to call it out to world leaders. Now, back during the Bosnian War, we actually had some effect. I wrote a story one Sunday about a young boy who was playing soccer and was blinded in Srebrenica. He went outside, he hadn't been outside for months. A shell came down, hit him, he was blinded. And I found him in a hospital outside of Srebrenica, and I would sit with him for days and talk to him. And he just, like many children, he couldn't understand. I was playing football one moment, the next moment, I can't see. So in my anger and my passion, I wrote a story about him for the Sunday Times of London, where I then worked. Margaret Thatcher read it and went on the floor of Parliament, and in her, very bossy way, but wonderful way, basically berated the politicians and the people listening to her that we have to do something. They did something too late after Srebrenica, but the war in Bosnia remains for me a case study of humanitarian intervention too late that could have saved so many people's lives. From there, I went to Africa, and I reported the genocide in Rwanda, where 1 million people were killed in 100 days. Now, this was one of the most horrific dark stains on humanity. And the 90s was full of bloodshed and misery in terms of war. The wars of the 1990s were horrific. And I was privileged enough to have been able to be a frontline witness and an observer. And as you all will gather evidence in a forensic medical way, I was gathering evidence as a writer. So my notebooks were full of testimonies, of maps that people drew me where mass graves were, so that once the conflict was over, I could go to those mass graves and try to interview witnesses. So this is where I really started my forensic work as a human rights journalist. After Rwanda, I basically covered all the wars in Africa, which got increasingly more and more horrific. Sierra Leone, where the main characteristic was amputating civilians at either the wrist or the elbow by the rebel forces. Liberia, the use of child soldiers. Somalia, where again, my first port of call was the hospital in Mogadishu, which was actually an outdoor hospital under trees, where a doctor was like desperately trying to run between these trees to help people who had been injured in the shelling and the gun attacks and caught between clan warfare. Very, very hard to witness people suffering. I know you guys are trained in this, but I wasn't. So I always retained a soft heart, which I think has been really essential in my writing, in my work, in my books. I'm proud to still have that. I never got a tough shell. Then came 9/11, and 9/11 to me changed the template and the structure and the way we fight wars, because after that came Iraq, Afghanistan, and then the series of the Arab Spring culminating in the war in Syria, where I spent the longest period of time researching and writing my book, The Morning They Came for Us, which is essentially about torture. Horrific. And now I'm working, as Sebastian said, on, I finished a book about minorities, Christian minorities who are being wiped out. So this brings me to really what I want to talk to you about, which is moral injury. In the early 2000s, long before post-traumatic stress and its relationship to frontline workers was being investigated, I was approached by a rather extraordinary Canadian psychiatrist called Dr. Anthony Feinstein. And he was putting together a group of war reporters to do the first ever study on post-traumatic stress and how it affected war reporters. And it was later published in the American Journal of Psychiatry. Now, Anthony did the study over several years. And in the end, after this period, and he frequently saw us in person, but as you know, as clinical people, a lot of it was done by studying our habits, how much we slept, how much we drank, if we abused drugs, how he could determine how damaged we were by what we saw, which I call what we witnessed unbearable knowledge. What the things we saw, the mass graves, the killing, the atrocities, the torture, you can't unsee that stuff once you see it. It's there forever. The question is, how much did it damage us as witnesses? I was very happy to see I did not have post-traumatic stress. Many of my colleagues did. Many of them are no longer alive today. They killed themselves. They were killed in war zones. They drank themselves to death. They put guns in their mouths and shot themselves. They couldn't bear what they had seen. Somehow I escaped this. I don't really know why. Most of you as doctors might know more than me, but I did. But recently, Anthony came to me again and said, look, I'm launching a new study and it's on moral injury. And moral injury effectively is the scarring of our souls by witnessing things which go against the core of our moral compass. So me, having been brought up as a Catholic and as a spiritual person now, I believe in justice. I believe that human beings are good. I believe in humanity. I believe that essentially man will do the right thing. So when I talked to someone who was tortured by a doctor in Bashar al-Assad's regime, who removed his appendix without anesthetic, and this is in my book and it's documented and the records are all there. It's so horrific, I don't even want to talk about it now because I'll get too upset. It makes me question how someone could do this. How could people kill children? How could Russian pilots bomb hospitals in Aleppo, knowing full well there are doctors there struggling to save lives? How can a lone doctor, who Susanna and I both know, Dr. Omar Ibrahim, work for years in a basement hospital as a neurosurgeon in Idlib, desperately trying to get shrapnel out of the brains of children, meanwhile having to deal with Russian bombers who are deliberately targeting his hospital? How can this happen? This is when the issue of moral injury comes into play. Because when something happens so grievous that it basically questions your own values, little by little, it erodes your soul. So this is what Antony's working on now, and what I'm beginning to also study, which I'm writing a book about evil now, and this is going to be part of my my research. So, I mean, one thing we do know about moral injury is that while someone can sustain PTSD and moral injury at the same time, moral injury is not a mental illness, whereas PTSD is. And I think that's defined by the American psychiatric, the body that whatever Holly or Sebastian could, so whatever it is, but anyway, it is not a mental illness, but it is something that is soul destroying. Jonathan Shea wrote, Dr. Jonathan Shea wrote an incredible book during the Vietnam War called Achilles in Vietnam, which was about all of the veterans that came back and had witnessed things that went against everything they believed in, fighting a war they didn't believe in. The same happened during the war in Iraq, those who had to witness torture and came back saying, you know, how could we possibly live with this unbearable knowledge? So I'm going to end this because I know we're on a time limit and I want to take questions from you as well. What can I say to you as future doctors who will work in human rights from what I've learned from working in war zones for 30 years? I guess the biggest lesson I tell you is to listen to people. You know, being a good listener is the most important thing of all. And you're going to be, by the time you finish medical school, a lot, you know, you're going to have a lot more knowledge than the people you're talking to, but it's so important to maintain humility. Humility and compassion and empathy and never losing that. And also your sense of who you are. Because I think when you're thrown into war zones or situations where you are having to document human rights, you begin to question humanity. And you begin to think, you know, how can this happen? And I know I've had this conversation with Holly's husband, Galen, who is, you know, the unbelievable theologian at All Souls in New York, about how can a God allow these things to happen, such acts of evil? And you have to somehow keep within you your own humanity, your own direction, your own sense of righteousness, your own sense of justice, and just keep doing it. Know that you're on a path and keep focused and keep alert. And most of all, like, don't stop listening to people, what they're saying, what they have to tell you, even if it's difficult for them to do it. You know, I could spend a whole nother lecture talking to you, which Yumna, who was in my class at Yale yesterday, I started talking to my students. I teach a human rights course about when they are in the field, how to interview people who have been deeply traumatized. But probably the most important thing is to let them talk and to let them tell their stories. So I'll leave you on that. And I'm very happy to answer any of your questions, comments, and I wish all of you well. You're all my heroes. What you will do is so vital to humanity, especially in these horrific COVID times, because that also is an issue of moral injury. You're going to have to make decisions which are life and death. And how you do that is massive. So you too will be susceptible to moral injury on some levels. And finally, as a society, what we've gone through, and I don't want to offend anyone who is a Trump supporter by any means, but what we've sustained witnessing the past administration lying, the racism, the misogyny, the sexism, everything that went along with it. For some of us, it's wore away at us, and it's been an incredibly difficult time to sustain, again, your moral compass. So I just want to, make you aware of that, what you are living through as physicians and physicians to be. You are living through COVID times, a raging pandemic. You're living through political instability. You're living through witnessing things that are enormous. So I'm wishing all of you the very best, and I know you're going to go out there and do great things and make the world a better place, which is all any of us could ever hope for. So thank you very much for giving me this chance to speak.
Thank you so much, Janine. We have a couple of questions in the chat. Rebecca has a question. I'm not sure, Rebecca, if you want to ask it yourself, or if you want somebody on our team to ask.
I can ask. I'm here. I was wondering, in consideration of COVID and all the restrictions now, what you would want to see us as medical students do about the situation in Ethiopia. I know for me, I've just been following it and being very obsessive and accidentally mentioning it in residency interviews. So I would like to figure out what I could do, which would be helpful.
We can't be in the field right now, right? So like if it was normal times, I'd say to you what I would say to my students, try to find an NGO or someone you could work with, a local NGO on the ground, and try to get yourself there, because there's nothing like being in the field. Nothing replaces it, but you can't do that now. So what I would say is use your voice, combined with your expertise in medicine, to write about what is needed there, the possibilities of what could happen there. Because, there's two things that really worry me about the Horn of Africa. One is the risk of famine, and the risk of, alighting other civil wars of countries that are so vulnerable, South Sudan, Somalia. So maybe what you could do is draw attention to doctors in places like Somalia, South Sudan, who are working against all odds. And one of the great things, well, I don't want to say great things about the pandemic, because nothing's been great about this, but because Zoom and online platforms are more viable, you could find somewhere to write as a doctor to be, about, the situation of physicians in Somalia, and how that might, how the conflict in Ethiopia might play out. And I'm sure Susanna could hook you up with doctors in these places, or even interviewing MSF doctors. I've worked very closely my whole career with Physicians for Human Rights and MSF, Doctors Without Borders. These guys have been invaluable in my work, because they're always the first ones in and the last ones to leave. And, sometimes they find reporters or writers a bit of an annoyance because we get in their way, but ultimately we can deliver a message that they cannot. So Rebecca, I would use your voice right now, until the time comes when you can jump on a plane to Addis. Use your voice, use your power, use your intellect, use your smarts, use your medical knowledge to make the world aware of what's happening.
Let me just add to that, Janine, in the recommendation to use your voice. Rebecca, for Rebecca's specific question, but for all of you students here, I just wanted to call your attention to an organization called the Op-Ed Project. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's actually started here in New York City, and they give fabulous, fabulous courses. Some of them are very short. I had the honor of attending one many years ago on a Saturday, and they teach you how to write an op-ed. It's an extraordinary experience. And they're on my mind because I got an email from them yesterday saying that they have all these online courses now. So go to their website, sign up for one of their courses and learn how to write an op-ed. And you may be thinking, well, I'm just a medical student. What have I got to say? I'm not an expert. And one of the most wonderful things about this course is they locate your expertise in where you are right now in your life. And in fact, you guys are all experts on being medical students and what it feels like to be a medical student and wanting to change the world and wanting to go out and make a difference. And yet you have other obligations. Those are all things that you can bring into a piece. So go check out the op-ed project and sign up for one of the courses.
There's a couple questions here. I think I can answer them directly. The first one to Adnan. Adnan, where are you? Okay, so you're asking me, well, why don't you ask the question, tell everyone, and then I'll respond to it. It's about Jamal Khashoggi, and it's about the Israeli demolishing Palestinian homes in the West Bank. Adnan, you there?
Hi. Yeah, my question was pertaining to how we can reconcile the silence of Western democracies who pay lip service to democracy and promoting freedom across the world, and they look the other way when we look at all the atrocities that take place in places like Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates and what they do in Yemen, the assassination of Khashoggi. Somehow democracy and human rights vanish in facing billions of dollars worth of arms deals. How do we deal with that? How do we reconcile that?
That's moral injury, right? So, Adnan, I've lived with this for 30 years. I've lived with the genocide in Srebrenica and Rwanda, and later seeing the the potential Yazidi genocide as well. I've lived with seeing doctors get bombed in Aleppo, my friends, my colleagues, and the West doing, or the international community doing nothing. I've gone to politicians, I've gone to heads of state, I've talked to people, I've given lectures. But you know what? It's not in vain. And again, it sounds trite, but we have to use our voice. We just keep going, and we have to be, the anger that we have and the indignation. You can't be shrill, because people turn off to a shrill, or if you're, you have to continue this work in a calm and dignified way so that people do listen to you. Otherwise people think, okay, they're too far off. I mean, I see it as my life's work, right? So in that way, if this is my life's path and this is what I'm doing, little by little, we make a difference. And we do make a difference. I mean, what's happening in Yemen and Saudi is horrific. But again, my job, I write about it, right? Your job might be someday you're going to go to Yemen and work in a hospital there. We have to keep going. And I know that's pretty lame advice to you, but I truly mean it from my heart. You just cannot give up. And there will be dark days. There will be days when you think, no one's listening to me. I'm not making a hell of a bit of difference by working in this clinic, but you are. And you have to see it in the long run. This is your life's work. This is your life's path. Now, the question of Palestine. Listen, when I woke up the other day and saw that Pompeo went to a settlement, therefore legitimizing what the Israelis do in the occupied territories, made me so angry I wanted to scream. And I met a friend for coffee that morning who I had a fight with, who said to me, why do you call them the occupied territories? They're the disputed territories. And I said, no, they're occupied. I'm sorry. If you have taken every shrapnel of human rights from people, if you have reduced them with no dignity, taken away every right they have, and occupy their land and take it for more and more annexation, that under international law is occupation. So I don't want to get too waylaid on this topic. You can read about what I write about it. I'm very outspoken on it. Hopefully the new administration, you know, under Trump, of course, he moved the embassy to Jerusalem, which was a stab in the back for Palestinians. His son-in-law made deals with the UAE, which basically shut out Palestinians from any kind of peacemaking deal. It's abhorrent, but hopefully we're going to have a new administration and again, keep speaking out on it. That's all we can do. There was another question too, I think, from someone about if my morals have changed. Nick, is it Nick or anyway, Sebastian, do you want to guide the next question?
Yeah, I'll just invite Nick to ask your question out loud.
Hi, Janine. Thanks for the talk. My question is, at least at Sophie Davis, we are required to take a course called Narrative Medicine, where we learn to listen to the stories of our patients beyond just what their numbers and charts say. Instead, listening to what they actually verbally say, what they choose not to say, and what their bodies say. From your perspective as a journalist, how do you think we, as future healthcare professionals, can become better listeners and advocates for our patients?
Really good question. And it's funny because I got a message this morning from a doctor who is a specialist in post-traumatic stress disorder. And she read my piece on moral injury and she wrote to me saying, I'd really like to talk to you about this. And for some reason, I kept putting her off and changing the date and changing the time, and I wasn't available. And she just wrote to me like literally an hour ago saying, you do realize that one of the signs of post-traumatic stress disorder is avoidance. So you said something just now, which was, how can we listen to what they're not saying? And I think as physicians, what you really have to do is be incredibly caring listeners. And I know that that's going to be tough for you because of you're going to have time limitations and you're going to have demands on yourself. But one thing I would really stress, and I've seen this over and over again, is the inequality of medicine in America, which shocks me because I spent my life in countries that had socialized medicine, in the UK and France, meaning I had amazing healthcare without paying outrageous fees for private health insurance. And I came back to America and a member of my own family was on Medicaid, whatever is I don't even know, the one that you get the least care. And he was taken in for a treatment and he overheard the doctor saying to the nurse, only give him 10 minutes, he's on Medicaid. And I think the dehumanization of patients who either are so economically challenged or the clear racial divide in America, who gets sick, who doesn't get sick, who gets medical care, who doesn't get medical care, really, really shocks me and upsets me. And I hope in some way that Nick, you and your colleagues will be able to address this on a different level, whether it's giving them more time, whether it's listening to them, whether it's trying to work out policies of how everyone gets equal health care. Everyone has the fundamental right of livelihood, water, a job, but also having health care and staying alive and staying healthy. So I hope that answers your question. I know it's a kind of roundabout way, but I'm basically saying to you the need to listen to what they're not saying and try to assess what they need from there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Janine. And we have another question from Mike. So I'll invite you, Mike, to just say your question out loud.
Dr. Giovanni, thank you so much for your amazing talk. I was just curious. So I remember seeing this photo of an extremely malnourished child during the Yemen crisis, or the highlight of the Yemen crisis. I was wondering if you were interested in photography as a way to express moral injury. Like, as the cliche goes, a picture says 1,000 words.
Absolutely. I think, you know what, it was always a bit frustrating for me that I'd spend months and months in the field gathering evidence to write a report, but a TV camera could go in and they would reach so many more people. But that's important, you know, and photography, I love photography. I work very closely with very good photographers, but I can't multitask. You know, when I'm in the field, I really need to focus and take very, very detailed notes, because sometimes my notes will be used in war crime tribunals, and that has happened in Bosnia and in Sierra Leone. So I need to get like really detailed stuff. I can't take pictures at the same time. And you know, the advent of iPhones have, in my view, destroyed the art of photography, because now everyone is a photographer in the same way that everyone's a writer. But it is, you know, I will take iPhone photos or films. When I was in Syria, I did a lot of filming, but mine aren't very good. They're rubbish. The New York Times actually gave me like a training course when I was going to Syria to try to learn how to make films properly. But, you know, I think you need to focus on one thing. And if you know what you're good at, like you will all specialize, right? At some point, you'll take a specialized medical degree. One of the real arts of getting older and growing up is knowing what you're good at, like determining, I'm good at this, but I'm not good at this. You know, I'm a good negotiator, but I'm not a good, I'm not good at making money. I'm a writer. That's what I do. That's my skill. And I need to hone that as best as I can to be the best writer I can and be the best person I can. So for me, it's only one thing. For you, you might be a brilliant multitasker, but absolutely photography, films go so much further than what a writer can do, but both have a place.
All right, thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions? If not, if I missed anything, please speak up if you have any questions for Janine. Otherwise, we can go forward.
Hi, I had a quick question if I could ask. I typed in the chat a bit ago. So first of all, thank you so much for your time and for the talk. And my question was regarding how your personal values have changed throughout your time in the field and witnessing those atrocities firsthand. And if you've witnessed shifts in your moral compass, and if so, how readily you were able to change your mindset in accordance with those new perspectives.
Well, you know, it's interesting because I do know, look, I have always been, a friend of mine calls me a tender soul. And that's never changed. I remember being in the siege of Sarajevo. There was an old people's home, and it was on a front line near the airport, for any of you who know Sarajevo, which was a horrible, you know, front line, heavy fighting going on. And there was this old people's home, and the healthcare workers had run away because they were scared. And, you know, it was really terrifying to be bombed all the time, but they left the old people there in their beds, and it was freezing cold, and many of them died of hypothermia. So the UN, of course, as usual, abandoned them. And myself and another brave journalist, Kurt Schork, who was later murdered when we were working together in Sierra Leone by rebel forces, we went out there with the intention of seeing what was happening. But when we were there, of course, being human beings, we got caught up in trying to save lives. And I remember I was walking through trying to count the dead so that I could go back to the UN and scream at them to do something. And they would say, it's not within our mandate. But I was still doing it. So I was walking by this bed, and suddenly a hand reached up and grabbed me and pulled me down. And it was this old woman. And she said to me, Zima, which means winter. And it was so cold, I cannot tell you. I mean, Sarajevo had been an Olympic winter city, so freezing, there was no heat, there was no electricity. And she was dying. So I realized that, like, I had to do something, and I'm not a doctor, but I tried the best I could to give her first aid. And I screamed to behind me, help me, to one of my colleagues. And I saw a shadow of someone behind me. And I turned around, and it was one of my colleagues from an American paper, which shall go unnamed, a famous one. And he walked away. And later he wrote a book where he, quite honestly said he was horrified to see me do this because I was a journalist. I was not a doctor. And all of his journalistic training had taught him to be objective so that he should not interfere with, people, civilians. I saw it an entirely different way. I saw myself as a human being there and in Sarajevo, as did many of my colleagues. And we became almost social workers, but what else could you do? So you're asking if my morals changed. If anything, they became more pointed and more determined to do something. And, I couldn't save the whole city, right? I couldn't save people from being slaughtered at Srebrenica. But I did save a few people and got them out of Sarajevo, my godson being one of them, who's now, in his 30s, living in Canada, and he's alive. I did manage to get people food. I did manage to bring people firewood. So, all those nights I lay in my sleeping bag thinking I'm useless, and how can you do something? I would think of those lines, I think they're from the Torah, which is that if you can save one life, you can save humanity. And I do believe that is true. Second part answer of my question is when I had a child. I had a son very late in life. I'm very blessed to have had him, Luca. And once I had him, having a child and having those responsibilities and the protection thing of trying to protect him made it even harder for me to see children in war zones suffering and hungry and starving, or mothers handing me their babies saying, take them, make sure they're safe, take them with you. It's unbearable. And you will see that when you work there. And somehow you have to make a deal with yourself how you deal with that. And everyone is different. I have colleagues who are very, not cold, but they're like many doctors that I know. They've had to develop a show because they see so many people dying and so many people hurt that you have to somehow make a deal with yourself how you handle this. It might be that you go home and cry every night. It might be that you write about it. It might be that you close off a part of your emotions in order to survive. That's a very personal question. I know what I do. I mean, I cry a lot, which is fine. And then I write about it. And that is the solve, and that is the balm that allows me to carry on. So
thank you so much, Janine. Unfortunately, we do have to wrap up this segment, but thank you so much for giving us your time, for joining us, and for the incredibly interesting and insightful conversation. Thank you.
Good luck, all of you, and I hope to see many of you in the field someday. And you can follow me on Twitter. Sebastian will give you my details. Stay well, stay healthy. Thanks.
Take care, Janine. Thanks. And now we'll go on to AJ, the director of the PHR board, who's going to talk to all of the students.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you